Welcome, fool. A martyr's death. You will sit with the saints among the elect.
Hello, good afternoon everybody. First of all, thank you for being here. As I say every year, I know there are lots of other interesting choices. You could be looking at, pissing boys and girls and all sorts of other exciting things in Brussels. So thanks for being here for our symposium, our conference, The Haunted Isles, Folk Horror and the Weird in the UK and Ireland. The idea of today is to give you, firstly, a kind of overview of what we mean when we're talking about folk horror, but particularly weird folk horror. And also, I suppose, who was here last night for the TV evening? Was anyone here for the weird? Oh, great.
So we stayed until 2 a.m. Yes!
Oh my God, and you're still here. This is amazing.
Me.
Those of you who were here yesterday will have some insight already into why British people are the way they are. Part of today, in a way, I think, I had a conversation in the bar yesterday actually where somebody said, wow, I really understand why British people are how they are now. And this is part of what I think we'll maybe get to some extent today. So I'm joined by my colleagues Bob Fisher, Dr. Derek Johnston and Dr. Diane Rodgers. They're each going to give a talk lasting about 30 minutes. So we'll have 3 talks. Then we're going to have a short break. And after that break, we're going to have a panel discussion. So the speakers will stay for the panel discussion, but we're also, I'm pleased to say, going to be joined by Rupert Russell, who's the director of The Last Sacrifice, which was on yesterday, which many of you will have seen, and also by Robert Wynne Simmons, who's the director of Outcasts and the writer of Blood on Satan's Claw. So we're going to discuss the whole weird folk horror scene. Think of any questions you've got, save them for then. What we'll do in the panel is there'll be a discussion amongst the panelists, then we'll open it up to you for questions. So think of any questions that you've got. Make sure they're questions, by the way. It's never very much fun if someone talks for 20 minutes and it's not really a question. So think of some questions as we go along. We're happy to answer any of the questions. Anyway, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Bob. Bob is going to give you basically a kind of beginner's guide introduction to folk horror. Now, Bob is a writer and broadcaster. He's written for a number of publications, including Electronic Sound, Doctor Who magazine, The Fortean Times. Bob is a bit of a sort of everyman. He's done lots and lots of really fascinating and interesting things, particularly his touring show Scarred for Life, which is a really successful touring show that relates to some of the things we're going to talk about today. So, Bob, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for the clicker as well. Can everybody hear me okay? Yes, that's good. So, folk horror. What is folk horror? If you were watching TV or going to the cinema or reading books or even listening to music at any point in Britain in the 1970s, it's almost certain that you will have come across a genre called folk horror. Although back in the 1970s, it's extremely unlikely that anybody would actually have used that phrase, folk horror. Folk horror is very much a title that has been retrospectively applied. It took a long time to catch on. Am I okay? Hello? Is that better? No. So yeah, folk horror, this genre of horror, ubiquitous in Britain in the 1970s, almost to the point of saturation, as we'll discover. Essentially, this is a form of horror fiction that finds terror in the ancient, in ancient folklore, sometimes ancient music, in ancient landscape features, in ancient occult rituals, and even, from time to time, in ancient gods. So that's the folk bit. That's the folk bit of folk horror. Where does the horror actually come from? Well, often in these stories, it comes from these ancient traditions and ancient terrors bleeding through into modern life, intruding into the present day, and often punishing people who refuse to accept or believe in them. So this is very much the horror of what lies beneath. not just beneath the literal ground, although that plays a part as well, but what lies beneath the veneer of ordinary everyday life, the ancient things beneath the surface of modern life. Now, as a child of the 1970s myself, this is me in 1977 with our dog Penny. As a child of the 1970s myself, I absolutely fell in love with it. This is the curious thing about folk horror, particularly in the 1970s. It was often aimed at children. Lots of children's programs in Britain in the 1970s had a folk horror element. So I loved lots of this stuff, lots of the things that we're going to talk about tonight. To give you an example of how folk horror works, it's possibly easiest to talk you through some of the tropes, some of the typical tropes and plot lines and elements that crop up in folk horror stories over and over again. Because although the genre is quite broad-ranging, lots of folk horror stories explore very similar themes. So in a very, very typical, almost cliched folk horror story, you may find an outsider. An outsider arrives in an isolated community. So here we see, this is Edward Woodward in The Wicker Man from 1973. He is a policeman who has been sent to investigate the disappearance of a young girl in a very, very close-knit community on a remote Scottish island. So an outsider arrives in a very, very tight-knitted community. Often some kind of hidden object is found. There is a found item, sometimes with magical properties. So here we see, this is from a 1976 series called Beasts, written by Nigel Neal. It's an episode called Baby. Simon McCorkindale, who we see on the left here, again, he is an outsider. He's just arrived in an isolated village, and in the walls of his cottage, he finds a bizarre mummified animal. Some kind of found object often sparks off the weirdness in a folk horror story. It's as though the weirdness, the ancient oddness, is somehow channeled through a found object. There is often a very, very distinctive landmark feature somewhere around the village. So we see here, this is the location for the 1977 series Children of the Stones, which I know Diane will talk about in more detail a little bit later. I remember Children of the Stones as a child. It was, again, it is a children's program, and it absolutely terrified me. It was filmed in Avebury Stone Circle in Wiltshire. It's very close to Stonehenge. And the Stone Circle features very heavily in the story of Children of the Stones. Again, an ancient landmark feature that in some way channels the strangeness attached to the people of the isolated community. Very often in 70s folk horror, it is a stone circle, although there are other examples. We see ancient burial mounds, we see ancient cave systems, but some kind of distinctive landmark feature. The locals are a bit weird. This is a recurring feature. So an outsider comes to an isolated community, finds a weird object, attaches some kind of significance to a local landmark feature, and then discovers that the locals, who may be friendly at first, have secrets. They have dark secrets. So this is from a BBC Play for Today production called Robin Redbreast. And again, it's about an outsider who arrives in a remote village, finds herself drawn into all kinds of strange rituals. And speaking of rituals, they often play a big part as well. So there will be some kind of ancient ceremony conducted by the strange locals. We see here a scene from the brilliant 1971 film, The Blood on Satan's Claw. The writer Robert Wynne Simmons will be joining us later. But yeah, some kind of ritual, some kind of ceremony will take place to which the outsider, the freshly arrived outsider, is drawn into. And what is often the result of an ancient ceremony taking place? Why? It's the summoning of an ancient god, an old god. So in the 1970s, even Doctor Who, the classic British science fiction series Doctor Who, even Doctor Who went a little bit folk horror. This is from a 1971 story called The Demons. Now, being Doctor Who, Azal, who we see here, is not actually an old god. He is an alien from the planet Deimos. But aside from that, all of the other elements of classic folk horror are in place in this Doctor Who story. So when we look at 1970s folk horror in particular, what are the big hitters? What are the big hitters of 1970s folk horror? It's very difficult to look beyond 3 films that have become known in folk horror circles as the unholy trinity of British cinema. So we start with Witchfinder General from 1968, starring Vincent Price as the real-life Matthew Hopkins, who was the self-appointed Witchfinder General, really. He spent much of the 1640s putting the Witchcraft Act. The Witchcraft Act was an act of Parliament. It was British law that had been passed in 1603. Matthew Hopkins very much took it upon himself to enforce the Witchcraft Act, and he went around executing women that he considered to be in league with the devil. So Witchfinder General, it doesn't have too many tropes of what became the defining qualities of folk horror that we've talked about. But I think it does a really good job of introducing the aesthetic of the genre onto the cinema screen. It's very much about people, again, in isolated communities, doing things that are seen to be related to the occult. The second film from the unholy trinity, The Blood on Satan's Claw, from 1971. This is another purely historical film set in the early 1700s. So we have a found object. A deformed skull is found beneath the surface of a farmer's field, and a local girl called Angel Blake becomes possessed by a demon. Again, it has occult ceremonies, it has the old gods or the old demons appearing at the end. Written by Robert Wynne Simmons. This is the film, this has significance. It's the film that has become, or it's certainly become suggested, it's the film that actually sparked the phrase folk horror. As I said, that wasn't a phrase that you would have heard particularly in the 1970s. But it was used in a magazine article in 1970, written by the journalist Rod Cooper, who was reporting on the shooting of The Blood on Satan's Claw for a magazine called Kinney Weekly, and he described it as a folk horror film. Have we lost?
We have. Keep going. We'll get it back. In a second.
Okay. Hey.
Yeah. Sorry, this is the Nova, as you all know, so it wouldn't be the Nova without some kind of technical disaster.
The old gods are bleeding through into the computers. So yeah, Rod Cooper used the phrase folk horror in 1970 to describe the filming of The Blood on Satan's Claw, but it didn't really catch on. The director of the film, however, Piers Haggard, used the phrase again in 2004 in an interview with Fangoria magazine. Piers Haggard said he was attempting to make a kind of folk horror film. So this is the film that has become widely suggested, coined the phrase folk horror. And the third member of the unholy trinity, The Wicker Man, from 1973. So yeah, policeman Edward Woodward discovers that the inhabitants of a remote Scottish island are basically practicing pagans who conduct an annual ritual sacrifice to ensure that their crops never fail. I'm going to show you the original 1973 trailer for The Wicker Man for no other reason than it's absolutely brilliant.
I could a tale unfold whose lightest word would harrow up thy soul, freeze thy young blood. I'm here to investigate the disappearance of a young girl. Where is Rowan Morrison?
If Rowan Morrison existed, we would know.
I suspect murder.
Sergeant, I'm already
In the name of God, woman, what kind of mother are you? That can stand by and see your own child slaughtered.
You are the fool, Mr. Howard.
You're liars. You are despicable little liars.
Shivers down my spine. Just wonderful, brilliant film. So these are the three films that have become the cornerstone of folk horror in Britain, Witchfinder General, Blood on Satan's Claw, and The Wicker Man. But from the late 1960s, we just started to find folk horror absolutely everywhere. It really began to infiltrate every aspect of British pop culture. There is far too much to discuss. We'd need weeks to cover every single example, but just a few of them. Another Play for Today production. Play for Today was a long-running series of one-off original dramas broadcast by the BBC. Penda's Fen from 1973 tells the story of a very troubled young man called Stephen, he's incredibly religious, but he's also gay. And that conflict within him manifests itself in a series of visitations from angels, as we see here, from demons. At one point, he is visited by the ghost of the classical composer Edward Elgar. It's an extraordinary scene. And he is ultimately saved by the ancient forces that come from beneath the Worcestershire countryside. It's a rare example of actual positive folk horror, I always think. It's got quite a happy ending, Penda's Fen. Sky, a children's television series from 1975. Sky himself, who we see here, is the ultimate outsider arriving in an isolated community. He is an alien, or he is certainly from some kind of alternate dimension. It's never quite fully explained, but he is not of this earth. And when he arrives, the earth itself rejects him and tries to force him back and out of normal existence on the planet. So his quest is to find what he calls the Juggernet, which is a distinctive landmark feature that will return him back to his own rightful place in the cosmos. And of course, the Juggernet turns out to be a stone circle. Raven from 1977, Phil Daniels, just a couple of years before he made Quadrophenia. And Phil Daniels in another children's series. He is a teenage tearaway. He's been in prison. Again, he arrives in another isolated community. He gets involved with a distinctive landmark feature, in this case a network of underground caves that are being earmarked to store radioactive waste. And he becomes convinced that he is the reincarnation of the mythical King Arthur, as we see here. So again, ancient folklore, ancient traditions bleeding through into the present day. In literature, we find things like The Owl Service by my favorite writer of all time, Alan Garner. The Owl Service is from 1967. Again, it's a book for young people. It's about 3 teenagers who go on holiday in a remote Welsh valley. Again, outsiders arriving in an isolated community. They find in the attic of the cottage where they are staying a dinner service, a found object that somehow channels the weirdness of the valley itself. The dinner service is infused with a Welsh myth of a doomed love triangle that those 3 teenagers find themselves reenacting. It's a complex and brilliant book. I read it when I was 11 years old, and I still reread it every year or two, and every time I do, I find something new in it. We find folk horror in unexpected places as well. Those of you who were here last night may have seen the public information film, The Spirit of Dark and Lonely Water from 1973, essentially a 90-second folk horror film in which the spirit himself hangs around, well, distinctive landmark features again, in this case ponds and lakes and bodies of water on building sites, and drowns children that play in them. And it's a warning to real-life children not to play near dangerous bodies of water. Nobody who was alive in Britain in the 1970s will ever forget The Spirit of Dark and Lonely Water. It was incredibly effective. Rates of childhood drowning absolutely plummeted. Bagpuss, one of my favourite programmes of all time. This is a children's programme absolutely intended for children under the age of 5. And I adored it. It's very, very gentle. As you can see, it's a puppet series. Bagpuss himself is a saggy old cloth cat who runs a shop, and found objects are brought into the shop every day by a little girl called Emily. So again, we have found objects arriving, and they are all infused with ancient stories that only Bagpuss himself can know and tell. Folk horror even, weirdly, started to surface in real-life news stories. This is one of the most bizarre stories that made the news in Britain in the 1970s. It's the story of the Hexham Heads. So in the early 1970s, 2 children digging in their garden in the town of Hexham in northern England found 2 carved stone heads in the garden. There they are with one of them. When they brought the heads into the house, all holy hell broke loose. They claimed they'd been visited by a werewolf that climbed the stairs of the house and came into their bedroom. The next door neighbours said they had had strange visitations as well. The heads themselves were passed over to an academic called Dr. Anne Ross, who was an expert in Celtic stone carvings, and she confirmed that they were ancient carvings. So again, a found object. Anne Ross took the stone heads into her possession, and then she also claimed that she'd been visited by a werewolf. As you can see, this made the newspapers in the early 1970s, but in 1976 it made the TV as well. So this is actually a clip from a factual BBC news programme called Nationwide. The presenter, Luke Casey, a very respected BBC journalist, and they ran a whole feature on the Hexham Heads. It has so many of the tropes of classic folk horror, but it was reported as being real. It's an extraordinary thing. So what happened in the late 1960s to create such an explosion of folk horror fiction? I mean, it wasn't a completely new thing. We can certainly look back at earlier examples of what would now be thought of as folk horror. If you look at the writing of people like M.R. James, certainly writing about found objects infused with ancient terrors, and he was writing in the very early part of the 20th century. Writers like Arthur Machen, who was a Welsh writer, again exploring quite similar themes. Even Dennis Wheatley, hugely popular Dennis Wheatley, writing in the middle of the 20th century, who explored lots of similar themes of ancient gods being summoned at occult rituals. This is a little bit of a pet theory of mine, although I was delighted to watch Rupert Russell's film, The Last Sacrifice, last night, and discovered that he'd kind of come to many of the similar conclusions that I had, which was quite reassuring. I think we can look back at the writings of this woman. This is Margaret Murray, who, in the very early part of the 20th century, was a fairly renowned historian, academic. She was an Egyptologist, but she gained notoriety in the 1920s when she wrote a book called The Witch Cult in Western Europe. And she followed it up in 1931 with a book called God of the Witches. Now, Margaret Murray basically suggested that secret cults and covens of witches had existed underground in Britain and Europe for centuries. They had never gone away. They'd just been driven underground by the rise of Christianity, and they had had to operate in secret, conducting these dark, arcane, occult rituals and worshipping what she described as a horned god. So we've got some of the tropes of what became folk horror existing in Margaret Murray's factual writings of the 1920s and 1930s. I say factual. I think Margaret Murray's work has been slightly discredited now. She did not present an awful lot of evidence to back up her claims, but she became quite a famous figure. If you saw Rupert Russell's film, The Last Sacrifice, last night, Margaret Murray, she was not averse to turning up to places where she felt there had been some kind of occult connection. So Rupert's film is about a murder, a real-life murder in 1945 of a man called Charles Walton. It had all the hallmarks of a ritual killing. He was impaled by his own pitchfork in a farmer's field. Once the police basically said they don't know who did it, Margaret Murray turned up in the village itself and started talking about all kinds of theories of occult rituals and worship. So she was around. Now, interestingly, in Britain, I mentioned the Witchcraft Act, which was introduced in 1603. And this was the act that Matthew Hopkins, the Witchfinder General, was using to justify his persecution of women. So the Witchcraft Act was introduced in 1603. It wasn't exactly the same act that was still in place in the 20th century, but the Witchcraft Act had been continually replaced and updated, and it was still in existence in Britain until 1951, which I find extraordinary. So until 1951 in Britain, it was, and I quote, a crime for a person to claim that any human being had magical powers or was guilty of practicing witchcraft. Which is quite an extraordinary thing. I don't think it was rigorously enforced at any point, but it did still exist on the statute books until 1951. In 1957, we have this film, Night of the Demon. A brilliant film, in many ways a precursor of the explosion of folk horror that came about from the late 1960s onwards. The interesting thing, well, one of many interesting things about Night of the Demon, Margaret Murray was credited as a consultant on Night of the Demon, and not only that, in publicity for the film, she was described as a practicing witch herself. So they used Margaret Murray's notoriety, not just as an expert on the occult, but apparently as a practicing witch. They used this to sell Night of the Demon in a way that technically would have been illegal only a few years earlier. And I think this begins to open the floodgates. So by the end of the 1950s, we have people like Gerald Gardner, seen here relaxing with a friend. Gerald Gardner was a real-life figure. He was basically the pioneer of Wicca, the modern-day witchcraft in the 1950s. He had a coven in Bricket Wood in Hertfordshire that began life as a nudist colony. He was very interested in nudism, but that somehow metamorphosed into his interest in ancient witchcraft. And by the 1960s, we had people like Alex Sanders. I showed this picture to a friend of mine who looked at it and said, yeah, it's always the ones you least expect, isn't it? Alex Sanders became a huge figure in Britain in the 1960s. He was the self-proclaimed king of the witches, and he began his coven in Manchester. But by the mid-1960s, he'd moved down to London with his wife Maxine, who was his high priestess. And they set up a coven in the basement of their flat in Notting Hill in London. And Alex and Maxine would go on chat shows. They would go on TV, and they would give newspaper interviews in which they would very, very knowingly boast of their powers and their occult powers. They were extraordinary self-publicists. As you can imagine, this caused a bit of a stir in 1960s Britain. There is an incredible documentary called Legend of the Witches. That is Alex and Maxine on the film poster. It purports to be a serious documentary about the activities of Alex and Maxine in the basement flat in Notting Hill. It's very, very sensationalized. It's almost a sexploitation film. There's a lot of nudity in it, but it's a jaw-dropping thing to watch in 2025. The newspapers in Britain had an absolute field day with all of this, as you can imagine. So basically, the revival of interest in witchcraft and the founding of the new Wiccan religion, all of that translated to the British media as essentially sex orgies by Satanists. We can see, here's a clip from the News of the World newspaper from 1970. We get action over the witches in homes, in covens, and in Parliament. They are talking about our Black Magic series. I don't know if you can see the photograph on the top right-hand corner. Is basically it's a chat being attended to by two women wearing not very many clothes. And the caption says, flashback. Unknown to the coven, the man in this initiation ceremony was a News of the World investigator. He doesn't seem to be in any hurry to stop his investigations. So as far as the newspapers, as the media were concerned, essentially everybody in Britain was secretly a Satanist conducting sex orgies in their suburban house. It could be your next door neighbour. Now, I have an example of all of this that I absolutely love, an example of how this moral panic and how this interest in Wicca began to bleed through into mainstream popular culture in the most unexpected way. This is one of my favourite albums of all time. Has anybody heard this? This is great. I can find new converts here. Dave and Tony Arthur were a folk music duo who made several albums in the 1960s. And by the end of the 60s, they had become fascinated by folk songs that dealt in supernatural themes. So songs that were centuries old, but that referenced elements of the occult. And they wanted to record a full album of them. They also became really interested in any potential connections between centuries-old supernatural folk songs and the emerging new religion of Wicca. So they contacted Alex Sanders, the self-confessed king of the witches. They actually found him in the London telephone directory and phoned him up and said, "We'd like to speak to you." And Alex Sanders said, "I'd be delighted. Come along on Tuesday. We're holding a ceremony. You can join the coven." Dave and Tony Arthur absolutely did join the coven. They went to meet Alex Sanders. I've spoken to Dave and Tony at length, both of them, about their memories of this time. They were very complimentary about Alex, said he was very sincere, but they are both happy to admit that they absolutely did dance naked in Wiccan ceremonies in the basement flat in Notting Hill. And then they made the album. I can play you a little snippet of the album. Oh, can we play? Do we have sound? Oh, it's not a disaster if we don't. As we always say on these occasions, it worked earlier. Not to worry, it's fine, Russ, honestly. Okay. Hey! So as you can hear, it's a pretty hardcore folk album. It's very harsh. So Tony Arthur is dancing naked in Wiccan ceremonies in a basement flat in Notting Hill and recording songs about all kinds of bizarre, ancient, supernatural, occult occurrences, which makes it all the more strange that the next year, in 1971, she became a presenter on Play School, BBC One's programme for the under fives, and continued to sing songs about the occult on Play School. I interviewed Tony about this a couple of years ago, and I said, did it not seem a little bit weird that you went straight from dancing naked in Alexander's ceremonies to presenting Play School? And she paused and said, do you know what? That had never occurred to me before. It was the 1970s, darling. We were all hippies. Nobody cared. So you have suddenly got folk horror everywhere, popping up in the most unexpected places. I mean, there are other elements at play in the folk horror explosion as well, aside from program makers just looking at Wicca and at satanic naked ceremonies and sex orgies. There are other more complex elements at play as well. I think there's a class element. This is, it's a 1972 BBC series called Dead of Night, but there is one episode called The Exorcism. You see the actress Anna Cropper here. Again, she's an outsider who comes to a remote village, but she's very middle class, and her friends who arrive with her are all very, very middle class as well, and quite patronizing. And the working class, I don't want to say too much away because you should watch it, it's brilliant. But the ghost of a working class girl who has died in the same cottage begins to take revenge on them. So there is an element of class. Of very middle-class people patronizing working-class people who believe in the occult. I think there is possibly a reaction to the explosion of technology in the 1970s as well. So it's an era where in the 60s, the British Prime Minister Harold Wilson had talked about wanting to forge a new Britain from the white heat of technology. Suddenly everyone's got colour TV and fridges and freezers and washing machines and inside toilets, my God. So life is moving quickly in the 1970s, possibly too quickly for some people. And the changes, again, a children's series by the BBC in 1975 is about that reaction to technology, and mysterious klaxon sounds, and everybody suddenly becomes a raging technophobe and starts smashing up machinery, as you can see here. And Britain reverts to a pre-technological era, and those that can operate technology are persecuted as witches. So it's kind of a reversal of the classic folk horror tropes. So by 1976, 77, it's absolutely everywhere. It's impossible to be in Britain and escape folk horror. And then, by the end of the 1970s, it's all but gone. Now again, this is a personal theory, and I've thought long and hard about this. What happened towards the end of the 1970s that made TV program makers, filmmakers, suddenly think, no, we don't want to do this anymore. We want to do something different? I think you can sum it up in 2 words. Star Wars. I think Star Wars changed everything for British TV program makers, film directors in the late 1970s. Suddenly kids weren't interested in stone circles and ancient rituals anymore. My friend Stephen Brotherstone, who wrote the Scarred for Life books, he puts it beautifully. He says, if you were a child in Britain in 1978, then suddenly the most boring place in the world was a field in England. We wanted to be in a galaxy far, far away. So there are elements of folk horror that rumble on throughout the 1980s and 90s. There are glimmerings of it. It doesn't go away completely, but it's nowhere near the saturation that we see in the 1970s. However, it probably hasn't escaped your notice that there's something of a comeback taking place. And suddenly folk horror is very, very fashionable again. And I wonder if we can trace it back to one particular film from the late 1990s. I think we can look at the Blair Witch Project, which again incorporates so many of the classic tropes of folk horror. You have outsiders arriving in an isolated community. You have found objects hanging from the trees. You have ancient traditions and sinister rituals bleeding through into the present day. And it's a huge global success. And I think it just sparks a revival that continues to this day. I mean, that's a subject for another day, I suspect, but we can look at films like Pan's Labyrinth, Guillermo del Toro using the backdrop of the Spanish Civil War to explore dark folklore. A Field in England, British film from 2013, set during the mayhem of the English Civil War. We've got The Witch from 2015. We have Midsummer, hugely successful, 2019. Almost a remake of The Wicker Man, I always think, but hugely successful. More recently, Ennis Main, which is a film that I absolutely adore, and I urge you all to watch it if you haven't done so already. So suddenly, folk horror is back. And unlike in the 1970s, it now seems to be firmly recognized as a very distinct genre and a very identifiable artistic movement. And I think that's a huge difference. So whereas nobody in the 1970s would really have said, I'm making a folk horror film, because it just hadn't been recognized as a coherent genre with a name at that point, I think in 2025, they almost certainly would say, I'm making a folk horror film, because now everybody knows what folk horror is, and it's become incredibly marketable. And I think that, as much as anything, means that folk horror in the 21st century is arguably more popular than it was in the 1970s, and we are clearly all still fascinated by what lies beneath. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. Okay, I'd like to invite our next speaker up. So our next speaker is Dr. Derek Johnston, who's a lecturer in broadcast at Queen's University Belfast. He's an all-round expert on all things related to, I guess, Nigel Neal in particular. Would that be fair, Derek?
I'm not going to claim any expertise at all.
He is an expert. He's being too modest. We're all being very British about this. But Derek's got an edited collection coming out called Nigel Neal and Horror, actually in the next few weeks. But I will let Derek sell that to you in a moment himself. But over to you, Derek.
Is that recording? That sounds on. Good.
You've got the mic.
Okay, it seems I have to use both. I've got two mics here. Stereophonic sound. Thanks for that, Bob. Bob doing a great lead-in there. That one of the things I'm going to be doing is the thing you should never do in a folk horror film, which is peer too deeply into what lies beneath. So if this gets too much, then that's my fault. So let's start with a couple of key ideas. First one, the media provide us, generally, with most of our ideas and our understanding of the past, of history. And the past then connects us to ideas of identity, whether that is based on location or on culture, and how location and culture connect and intersect. And I'm sure it's not just something in the UK where politicians complain about representations of the past in the media and how it damages national pride and a sense of culture. It's usually when it dares to do things like tell a narrative where powerful white men are not the only people who actually get things done. That maybe these are stories which say that colonialism and empire weren't good things overall. So those get pushed back against. Such discussions of representations of the past are common in relation to historical dramas, whether literary adaptations or based on historical events or set in a particular historical period. It even extends to historical sitcoms, to romantic historical fantasies such as Bridgerton, don't read the IMDb remarks, and time travel shows such as Doctor Who. But rarely have I seen such concerns expressed about horror. What I want to do now is look at how folk horror, bit of hauntology, bit of the weird, but mostly folk horror, are very much about our ideas of the past and our hopes for the future. Particularly the idea of the past as somewhere to escape to or escape from, and how that relates to our ideas of what is possible and our ideas of lost futures. Folk horror in particular connects past and present, and particularly the ideas of imagined pasts, imagined communities, and so imagined possible futures and alternative ways of being and organising. I'm not saying this is going to be a positive talk, but there's elements of it. So, some of you may have recognised that my title plays on a line from Nigel Neal's Murren. Here, a vet becomes involved in the conflict between a group of villagers and the old woman that they are persecuting as a witch. I should really have asked how to work this. And
all this talk. You're trying to prove there's no such thing. Well, you won't prove it to us. We know there is. Sick. They've got you trained to thinking nothing's true if it's not in books, or you can't shove it in a bottle and analyse it. That's called work out the rules, and what the rules don't fit don't happen.
The purpose of science...
Till you found you got the rules wrong.
Then we change the rules.
Oh. Well, that's it.
For better rules. But we don't go back. And that's what you're doing, isn't it? You're trying to justify the persecution of some poor half-witted old biddy. And how do you do that? Kill a cat in the name of magic and then go home and watch your colour telly.
Magic's a dirty word.
Yeah.
Scrying was magic.
Eh?
In the olden times, they took a picture miles away, then it come before them on a bit of glass. Scrying it was called. Now they've got another name.
Double your money.
Coronation Street.
Gold it. But listen,
No opportunity, no...
Look, what I mean...
Hey, don't worry, son. What's going on here about someday it'll all be done in the textbooks, all fit for human consumption?
I'm not staying here to have my intelligence insulted.
It's not. No way it matters a stinking damn. If you run out now, it's only because of one reason. 'Cause you're scared.
so what we've got there is what I think is a key tension and draw of folk horror. That tension between science and belief, but with the idea that those beliefs may actually be more true than the science, that the science just hasn't caught up with them yet, that the black mirror of the scrying glass becomes the black mirror of your tablet or your television. Neil is saying that science says we build on the past, but we don't go backwards. But the drama itself shows, as you saw in that clip, that we do go back. We keep going back. We go back because the old beliefs help us to make sense of the world. We go back because that gives us the comfort of feeling like there is a meaning, there is a structure to things. We go back to the simple explanations for that comfort rather than the difficulties of dealing with the complexities that our modern understanding requires. We go back to what seem to be explanations rather than admitting that we do not know. It can feel, in the modern world, like things are out of our control, out of our understanding. So we keep turning back to when times seemed simpler, more understandable, more comforting, when questions had solid answers. And this is where folk horror, hauntology, and the weird come in. There is, for me, a very important tension in them. Hauntology is often about an unnerving sense of comfort, turning back to things that disturbed or disturb us, maybe seeking out the horrors that scarred us for life in childhood, because they are more comforting than the real horrors we have to deal with as adults. Or we can be more analytical about our ideas of hauntology, turning to Derrida or Fisher to think about the way that they represent not just lost childhoods, but also a sense of lost possibilities. As children, the future was full of possibilities. Holographic TVs, personal jetpacks, nuclear-powered lawnmowers, bases on the moon. Yeah, robots and computers were going to take a lot of the jobs, but they'd be the jobs that people didn't want to do. And as a result, everyone would be able to live a life of leisure and self-improvement. And then those years pass. Dates that were never really predictions, but seemed like it when we were children. 1984, 1999, 2000 AD. And the futures that they displayed never turned up. And the social frameworks that make them seem possible also disappear. And so we turn back to the horrors of youth that seem much more comforting and controllable now than the horrors of the real world. And because they carry with them the resonance of those ideas of public service, of good government for all, of technology in the service of us, all the bright potential of the future, we turn back. The weird, similarly, has a tension between disgust and fascination, between the inexplicable and the desire to understand. H.P. Lovecraft provides an example of this in his racist, classist classic, The Shadow over Innsmouth, not words you usually want to hear, which is not only weird, but arguably also an example of folk horror, another precedent. The narrator has managed to escape the town of Innsmouth, which is populated by a cult which not only trades with the aquatic deep ones, but also interbreeds with them. And then the narrator has called down the official power of the US government upon them. But the story ends with the narrator facing up to his own legacy as someone whose ancestors came from Innsmouth, as he realizes that he himself is transforming into a deep one. As Jonathan Newell has pointed out, the transformation is presented first as horrifying and yet fascinating and ultimately liberating. So it's possible to read the weird, at least in examples like this, as being the meeting point between fear of the past that is overcome by giving in to the experience of the present and letting go of the terror of the unknown. Being weird, being different, is a source of horror, but it also presents a fascinating possibility of a different way of being. Folk horror also has a common strand of the tension between the past and the present, not only on a wider social level, not just as the individual. While there are many different types of production that people have called folk horror for various reasons, and we could argue about this for years, I want to concentrate on some of the ones that Bob's picked out already. The idea of the rural community that has some connection to the past and to tradition, which may come from it being in a historical setting rather than the community itself seeking a return to the past. There's often a tension, as Bob mentioned, between the rural and the urban, the working folk of folk horror, and the middle class incomer, or the urban viewer watching this representation of the rural past. That representation offers nostalgic appeals to ideas of the rural as somehow more real than a modern urban lifestyle. There's an appeal to a life dedicated to the apparently simple things of working the land, of living in a community that shares work and entertainment and a sense of togetherness. Yet, as this is folk horror, there is also the tension that this togetherness is seen to either actually have fracture lines within it, or it comes at a cost, usually to that middle class urban incomer. I'm going to hit the theory bit now, sorry. It's very one way of helping understand the tensions between appeals and horrors of the past here is through Svetlana Boym's ideas of reflective and restorative nostalgia, which emphasize important different uses of the emotion of nostalgia. This is not just in terms of interpretation, but also in the potential for action and the connection of this interpretation to wider political and social ideas. Boym's reflective nostalgia uses the past as a tool, recognizing that it is impossible to go back to those imagined halcyon days, but that it is possible to learn from them and use those lessons to shape the present and future. Restorative nostalgia, on the other hand, seeks to recreate the past, to bring it back, to take back control, to make America great again. That past is usually, certainly to some extent, often completely an imaginary one, a fantasy of a time when things were better. And it also ignores the question of better for who? As Boym puts it, restorative nostalgia does not think of itself as nostalgia, but rather as truth and tradition, and so refuses to acknowledge the constructed nature of ideas of the past, or that it is impossible to return to them because current conditions are different. The tensions between these two positions are perhaps most obvious in 1973's The Wicker Man. So let's have a look at that, and I'll stop speaking for a moment. The Wicker Man, as we've been told, presents a remote Scottish community run by Christopher Lee's Lord Summerisle, who I will now hand over to for the backstory.
In the last century, the island was town. Like our days today, we expect vast assistance from sheep and sea. Then in 1868, my grandfather bought this barren island and began to change things. A distinguished Victorian scientist, agronomist, free thinker. How formidably never he seems. Essentially the face of the land incredulous of all human good. Very cynical. What attracted my grandfather to the island, apart from the profuse source of wiry labour it promised, was the unique combination of volcanic soil and the warm Gulf Stream that surrounded it. You see, his experiments had led us to believe that it was possible to induce here the successful growth of a certain new strains of fruit that he had developed. So, with typical mid-Victorian zeal, he set to work. Best way to country this, it seemed to him, was to rouse the people from their apathy by giving them back their joyous old gods. And as a result of this worship, barren island would burn and bring forth fruit in great abundance. What he did, of course, was to develop new cultivars of hardy fruit suited to local conditions. Well, of course, to begin with, they worked for him because he fed them and clothed them. Then later, when the trees started fruiting, he became very good at it. And the ministers fled the island and returned. What my grandfather had started out experiencing, my father continued out of love. He brought me up the same way, to reverence the music and the drama and the rituals of the old gods. To love nature and to fear it, and to rely on it and to his if were necessary. Brought me, having brought you up to be a pagan. A heathen considered, not, I hope, an unenlightened one.
Lord Summerall, I am interested in one thing, the law. But I must remind you, sir, that despite everything you said, you are subject of a Christian country.
So we've got all of those tensions there between science being masked basically by the use of traditions, contests between different forms of power, inherited and governmental. So we can think about this as a reflective form of nostalgia on the parts of the Lord Summerisle, using ideas of the culture of the past as a way of encouraging new behaviours in the common people, the wiry labourers, under the guise of a return to the old. To the people, though, it might be considered restorative nostalgia. They may have seen that this return to the past has results, that a return to the old ways has benefits. These benefits are not only in the fruitfulness of the land, but in community and in a more open approach to sexuality, all under the guise of tradition. It does not matter to them that these traditions have been cobbled together by Lord Summerisle from a mix of sources: Caesar's accounts of the German campaigns, Fraser's Golden Bough. Similarly, in Boehm's formulation of restorative nostalgia, it does not matter that the past that is invoked is an imagined one. It is the imagery and the idea and what people do with them that's important. So at this point, we have an authority figure exerting control over the common people by cynically manipulating their ideas of the past in order to encourage certain behaviours, which in turn would support his profits in the form of the money made from exporting the produce of Summerisle. This, of course, would never happen in real life. The people are happy to go along with this because they are happy with their return to an imagined form of the past, with folk song, folk dances, rituals and revels. This could be understood as the success of the nostalgic aspects of folk revivals, of the desire to return to simpler ways of living, governed by nature and the seasons rather than the clock of industrialization. It shows that it can work. And then the crops fail. The nostalgia is revealed as nostalgia, as a recreation of an imagined past, as reimagining the present in the shape of a past that never was. And if the traditions fail, then that can reveal that the lies that were the foundation of this way of living. The current Lord Summerisle cannot have those lies exposed, and so has to reinforce them, building on them, digging deeper into the imagined past. And so they come to the more terrible sacrifice. And in this more terrible sacrifice, we see the tensions of folk horror made clear. The folk gathered together in joyful song to celebrate their festival, and the outsider who suffers the horror of sacrifice. The blind return to an imagined past that never really existed. Scottish islanders acting at the behest of an English lord to recreate a ritual of Germanic tribespeople described in propaganda by their Roman enemy. It's the epitome of restorative nostalgia. Seeing this for what it is, wanting to recreate the sense of community and connection to nature, but without the elements of sacrifice and rejection of outsiders, and acknowledging that new ways are needed, that is reflective nostalgia. So do we cheer on the pagans as they sacrifice the symbol of external authority, as they slaughter the harvest king that his blood may feed the land, as they follow their ancient rites and traditions with deaths willing and unwilling? Then maybe we should question why we are prepared to accept such practices in the name of tradition. And maybe we can consider what other causes might make us consider such practices as acceptable. Do we instead see this as the horror of the grip of tradition and of nostalgic recreation taken too far? But Boehm's formulation does not just help with considering personal responses. Boehm herself links the consideration of nostalgia to different political conceptions of national identity. Her division into reflective and restorative allows us to separate those concepts of memory which are narrowly nationalistic, looking to the past as one true golden age to be returned to, and those concepts of memory which engage with the complexities of experience of the past and the different experiences of the past shared by different groups to inform the present. I argue that folk horror is accessible to both, that it draws particularly on ideas of a true national narrative that can return or which has survived in a hidden way, but that it also makes complexity part of its narrative, raising the question of whether this alleged true national identity is worth the cost. The relevance of this to current issues is made clear from Boehm's statement that modern nostalgia is a mourning for the impossibility of mythical return, for the loss of an enchanted world with clear borders and values. This is where I think these conceptions of nostalgia can help us in considering the particular relevance and appeal of folk horror at this moment, as well as about the context in which those original folk horror texts arose. Now, Bob's given some really important details here, but I've got a few others. The late 60s and early 70s were a time of economic decline and social unrest in the UK, combined with growing awareness of the ecological costs of modern life. Returning to the past in a sense of community and self-sufficiency seemed a sensible movement in terms of preserving the self and the planet. It also linked to ideas of the land and the nation as one, that there is some sort of specific national identity that relies on a connection to the rural. Moving forward, or even surviving economically, meant joining the European Economic Community, a move that was widely embraced. Entertainment made nostalgic calls back to Victorian and Edwardian eras of British imperial supremacy, possibly in part as a cultural response to the evident loss of British global power, but also at times challenging those narratives. And then we come to now. Less cheery bit. Where, even less cheery bit, where ecological collapse is even more evident, where societies and communities often seem to be more fractured, and where connections to the past seem far less clear and common, where a conservative government led the UK into Europe in the 1970s in order to save it following the end of empire. In 2020, following a 2016 referendum, a conservative government led the UK out of Europe. Those responsible did so making nostalgic calls back to the time of empire, or even more commonly to the Blitz spirit, continuing a myth of Britain alone that was really rejecting the reality that the UK at the time was still supported by the empire and was hardly a little island all on its own. But to recognise that would complicate the simplicity of the message. That's restorative nostalgia at its clearest statement of a desire to return to a time that it is impossible to return to, in large part because it was a time that never actually was, not in the way it's depicted. Folk revivals in culture have often occurred at times when the world seemed to be accelerating, taking with it tenses of tradition and connection to the past. They've often been led by middle-class people seeking to track down, record and revive songs, dances, tales and traditions of the folk. But in doing so, they take away something that was living and evolving, or dying away, and they set it down. They lock it in specific recorded form, potentially bowdlerizing, editing and adapting it to their own preconceptions and tastes, and of course turning themselves into the owners and authors. True traditions survive because they mean something, even as that meaning changes over time. And what they often mean is ultimately a sense of connection. It is this sense of connection and belonging that folk revivalists have often sought to draw on, as an opposition to the fragmentation of modernity. But in freezing those traditions, songs, dances, stories in time, it makes them the property of an individual. It locks them from evolving in a way that allows for new meaning to develop organically from the folk culture, from the needs of the people. And it can serve to say that only those who own these traditions are truly part of the culture, and anyone different does not belong. Look at the Hörger in Midsummer for how that goes. Folk horror plays its part by presenting the pleasures and challenges of the imagined past together. So yes, being part of a community where everyone knows their place, everyone knows everyone, and everyone celebrates together, that's got its appeal. That's nice. Especially if it was part of living a lifestyle more in touch with nature and making less of an impact on the environment. But it also means being apart from the rest of the world. It means not just abandoning the pleasures and benefits of the modern world, but it means becoming disconnected from it. That may be the problem at the root of the failing corpse in The Wicker Man. The land is exhausted and may be affected by climate change or environmental damage spilling over from the rest of the world. To try to remain separated from the world runs its own risks. Returning to traditions, real or invented, means sacrifices, metaphorical and literal. Escaping the power of central government means giving yourself over to local power. But that local power may well be using ideas of the past and tradition to manipulate and entrap to serve their ends rather than the general good. In a community where everyone has their place, anyone who tries to diverge from their pattern may find that their place, being the weird one, is as the sacrifice required to keep things as they are. Folk horror is a genre for our times because it is a genre of uncertainty. It offers apparent ways of being different from the homogenized, globalized, post-industrial world that envelops and devours us. It is a genre of longing for that which cannot be recovered, a genre which asks us what we would sacrifice in order to return to that idyll and to preserve it, while also asking us how we would feel when confronted with others who wish to sacrifice us to preserve their idealized connection to land and to identity. And it is a genre which ultimately refuses to provide us with simple answers in a complex world. So, which powers do you want to be sacrificed to? And now, marketing. This will be out by hopefully at the end of the month from Liverpool University Press.
Okay, thank you very much, Derek. I'm really, really pleased now to have Dr. Diane Rodgers on stage. Diane, is a senior lecturer in media at Sheffield Hallam University. Currently, she is writing a monograph entitled Weird TV, Folklore, Folk Horror and Television for BFI Publishing. Also is in a band fantastically called the Sleazoids, which I'm fascinated about. They're on YouTube, check them out. So Diane, I'll hand over to you.
And I've got a chapter in Derek's book, so two of us are marketing it for you, so extra reason. Thank you very much for having me. Anyway, we've also, Bob and I have cracked out all the 70s flared corduroy, especially for yourselves, so thank you. Appreciation for the suits today. So the reason I'm here, my specialism in terms of research is the way that folklore is communicated on screen in film and television. So I've got a film and TV background, but I also consider myself a folklorist very much. And when people talk about folk horror, they often don't talk about the folklore necessarily. So that's what I find really interesting. And that's why this festival is an absolute dream for me, because it's just put everything I'm interested in and write about all into one lovely package. So I hope you're enjoying being exposed to public information films and really, really grim dramas, and some of it's enjoyable along the way anyway. So today, I'm talking about how folklore and contemporary legends about British megalithic monuments, stone circles, how they are presented on screen in film and TV. And there's a few examples from various folk horror on screen here. So I'm looking at what kinds of ideas about stone circles persist in popular culture, and maybe what this can tell us about as a society a little bit. So what is folklore? Keep banging on about folklore, but it helps to define these things. Folklore can be basically understood as it's the kind of unofficial history, traditions of a people, and that can be expressed in our stories, in music, in dance, jokes, customs, all those kinds of things. And the communication of folklore, particularly within popular culture, that's where cultural beliefs can come from. It can shape our actions, it can shape our behaviour. And the most accepted characteristic of folklore is the way it is communicated, the way it's passed on from one person or a generation to another. It's not in an official way. We just kind of accept this kind of received knowledge we get somehow. And we are all folk. Every single person in this room, we all have our own folklore. We are all part of some kind of community, whether it's fans of folk horror, or whether it's a traditional family, or an online gaming community. All of those different communities have our own stories or our own ways of doing things. We have our own history. So you have your own folklore in lots and lots of different ways, and there's things you do every day as well. So in folklore studies, the way we get this knowledge, the way we communicate these things, is as important as what is communicated. So the way it's passed on is really interesting. And when we talk about legends as well, legends are types of informal stories, again, about something that's often believed to have existed or have some element of truth to it or might have actually occurred. So it's kind of just another type of folklore, but it's a very specific different type. And we're all kind of familiar with myths and legends, kind of the Arthurian myth, mentioned King Arthur earlier, Robin Hood, all those kind of, I'm sure you've heard of all those figures. So there's kind of an element of maybe some kind of degree of historical truth to it. So film and television are means of communicating folklore and legends, of course. And in doing so, has the potential to influence our perceptions about things. It's probably where most of us get our ideas about what a ghost is, or what a witch is, or where we get our ideas about prehistory. So media really shapes these ideas and how they are then continue to be passed on in popular culture. So modern film and television, in Britain at least, is still absolutely bursting with folklore and folkloric themes. And this is television still aimed at both adults and children, and fact and fiction, or at least programmes posing as fact at least. So there's just a small example of relatively recent examples here from Wurzel Gummidge, which is a revived children's TV series from the 1970s, but has recently been revived again, uses legendary ideas like about the Green Man or seasonal rituals. TV series Ghosts, of course, playing with examples of notions of spirits and hauntings. Lots of episodes of series like Inside Number 9, some of you might be familiar with. Episodes like The Devil of Christmas talks about the Krampus legend. And even the gentle comedy Detectorists. I don't know how many, has anybody seen Detectorists in this room? A few people, excellent, okay. And it's fine if you haven't, because I'm going to show you a clip from it in a moment. But it's important to remember this is a gentle quite a gentle comedy. And it's about people who go out with metal detectors looking for treasure, basically. That's all you really need to know. But even this series, it's not folk horror, it's kind of a sitcom, but it uses folk music, it uses legends and stories of the past. Again, as both Bob and Derek have touched on, there's something just beneath the surface of the land in Britain. So I'm just going to show you a brief clip here in which the two main characters, called Lance and Andy, they've just found and dug up an ancient whistle. What could possibly go wrong? Let's try and blow it. Let's just see what happens. I should note that there are, if you look at old recorded examples of folklore, there are lots of recorded tales about ghosts being raised by whistles. So this is a sitcom, but this is how this is what happens when you inject a bit of folklore into it.
Go on.
Pub? Go on then.
I'd love to actually listen to the rest of that song. Glorious music by a band called The Unthanks. I should give nod to them. That's not typical in Detectorists. It is a sitcom. I'll just remind you of that. But it's quite creepy. It's eerie. There's that injection of folklore. There's these ghosts of the past kind of being resurrected. We're being taken back to prehistory by this little kind of bit of folklore used in the program. So whenever TV and film tends to use a bit of folklore, it suddenly becomes spooky. Folklore is just used as this spooky thing. It's shorthand almost. And often, as again has been mentioned, things are being unsurfaced. There's almost like something sinister is just beneath the land, or beyond, under the skin of us British people. Let's scratch the surface. What darkness lies beneath us? You never know. So that idea of something being lurking in the landscape brings us to the use of stones on screen. Now, some of you might be familiar with This Is Spinal Tap. If you're not, it's a comedic mockumentary from 1984 featuring a marvellous song called Stonehenge, which has lyrics in it that mention druids, demons, banshees, magic, dragons, the pipes of Pan, talks about sacrifice, fairies, and stone circles. So there's a kind of classic tick list of folk horror hits there for you. Though the song's performance in the film it's clearly for comedic intention. It's made ridiculous because of a mistake in the scale of the props. Stonehenge is meant to be this big, glorious model that comes down onto the stage. So it ends up being a bit silly, but I think despite that, it really demonstrates the band's intention in the film is to inject a sense of awe and fascination and mystery that comes from stone circles and these kind of mystical notions about ancient stones. So because I just can't resist showing you a clip of this song, check out the lyrics if you can make them out. Here's a very different version of folklore to take us into stone circles.
The Druids. No one knows who they were or what they were doing, but their legacy remains hewn into the living rock of Stonehenge. Children of Stonehenge, beneath the haunted moon, for fear that daybreak might come too soon.
Fantastic. We've quoted several times already this weekend, the Druids. No one knows who they were or what they were doing. That sums up folklore, basically, doesn't it? Okay, as part of my research, I'm not on Twitter anymore, I should just say, for political reasons, but I've used it as a research tool in the past. And a couple of years ago, I posted a tweet about some research I was doing about film and TV that prominently features stone circles, etc., in some way. And I did not have many followers at all on Twitter, and that's really important. I had like fewer than 1,000, something like that. And I was absolutely astounded that this post was engaged with over 191,000 times. That's unbelievable for me. I could not keep up with the responses and the comments and the shares with it. So this engagement with stone circles is obviously, it's a continuing popular fascination. Recent stories in mainstream British media from just last month, stories in The Guardian, in the Financial Times, this kind of, why are we so continually fascinated with stone circles? And it's not just for audiences, but writers and directors as well. A few years ago, I interviewed Piers Haggard, who directed British folk horror classic Blood on Satan's Claw that's been already mentioned today. He described stone circles as history with an added mystery factor. They're wonderfully interesting because they work on your imagination. So he was still reading books about stone circles in kind of in 2017 when I spoke to him, excited by the story possibilities that they offer. And contemporary directors equally share this fascination with the landscape and these kind of markers in the landscape. Ben Wheatley said about his film A Field in England, he said, "There was something in the landscape that plainly terrified me." And he spoke to me about feeling just constantly surrounded by just this sense of history almost within reach in the UK. And he said, you can walk 10 miles from wherever you are and find an ancient monument. Where I live, we walk the dog around a Saxon hill fort. And it's very common everywhere. I mean, I know it's not unique to Britain, this history in the landscape, but it feels very tangibly close, kind of something, again, just beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. So there's this real kind of, like I said, tangible sense of something sinister or history present in the physical landscape, which stones are often used to overtly represent on screen. Robert Wynne Simmons, who's going to join us in a little while, writer of Blood on Satan's Claw, he said to me that using ancient sites on screen actually gives you part of the story. And I really, really like that idea, because we think stones already have so many associated stories, legends, folklore that come with them. Just the act of putting those stones on screen, you've already got those stories there in the background before you then add another narrative on top of it. So, and the way that ancient stones are used in folk horror, they're nearly always absolutely central to the narrative. Excuse me. They bring something from the surface of the landscape directly onto the screen. A writer called Robert Macfarlane wrote a wonderful article called The Eeriness of the English Countryside, and discusses the idea of English eeriness as the skull beneath the skin of the countryside. Again, the idea that you just have to scratch the surface to find something sinister there. Now, part of the enduring appeal of stone circles, I think, is no doubt the fact that there are so many folkloric tales about them, but also the lack of information we have about them. There are no definitive answers that we can give. You can kind of project your own story onto it. It kind of acts as fuel for our imaginations. Even in the really well-documented case of Stonehenge, scholars like the really well-known folklorist Ronald Hutton can only use kind of educated guesswork about its origins. He says, literary sources do not tell us anything conclusive about the midwinter practices of the ancient British Isles. So make up your own folklore here, folks. And someone who did that was Nigel Neal. So there was a 1979 British TV series called Quatermass. And in that series, there is a fictional stone circle called Ringstone Round. And that is, not surprisingly, absolutely central to the narrative. For those not familiar with Quatermass, he was a character, Professor Bernard Quatermass. He was a heroic scientist who appeared in a lot of different TV, film, radio productions, all written by Nigel Neal across many, many decades. So a really well-known character for many decades in the UK. In this particular version, Quatermass is a bit older. He's played here by John Mills in the middle. And he's searching for his missing granddaughter, who's become a member of a youth cult called the Planet People, who you can see in the top right there. And they basically believe that they are going to be beamed to their salvation in space, but they're actually being conditioned to gather at stone circles. I won't ruin the rest, but it's not good, folks. Not surprisingly, it being an example of folk horror. Now, Nigel Neal originally intended to use Stonehenge in both the name of the stone circle as well as a filming location, and kind of weave in a blend of recorded history and folklore about stone circles with his fictional plot. Now, Stonehenge is probably the best known prehistoric monument, at least in Europe, if not the world, thanks in particular to lots of mystical theories surrounding it that are accumulating since the Middle Ages about its construction, about its purpose. In the 12th century, Geoffrey of Monmouth described how it was through the ingenuity of Merlin, the wizard of Arthurian legend, that the great megaliths of Stonehenge were brought to Salisbury Plain by magic from Ireland. So they were magically floated across the British Isles. I would have loved to have seen that. I like that story. Whereas in the 1960s, science fiction writer, theorist Eric von Daniken, who you may have heard of, suggested Stonehenge was a landing pad for alien terrestrial craft, which fueled a lot of very different set of theories about ancient alien astronauts, which still persist. There are lots of TV shows called Ancient Aliens. There are channels dedicated to showing these programs. But that was particularly revived in kind of 60s, 70s New Age culture, very much reflected in Neil's Planet People that were on the previous slide, but basically hippies, really. Now, Stonehenge wasn't used in Quatermass, basically because they couldn't afford to film there. But it inspired Nigel Neal to invent his own stone circle. And he said he wanted a resonant name for it. So Ringstone Round was born. And the name lends itself really well to a nursery rhyme that Nigel Neal invents in the series, Huffety Puffety Ringstone Round, which, of course, for anyone familiar with UK nursery rhymes, I don't know how much you are, but it's very similar to Ringa Ringa Roses, that kind of has its own historical resonance and has connections with the kind of plague era and that kind of thing. So the kind of Ringstone Round nursery rhyme adds another dimension of quite plausible history and legend to this fictional creation. There's another fictional stone circle in Quatermass that's referred to as the Stumpy Men, and looks similar, not dissimilar, to the Merry Maidens in Cornwall. But the name recalls what we call petrification legends. So petrification might be a difficult word to easily translate. So it just means something turned to stone, something kind of frozen, turned to stone. So these types of legends are commonly associated with stone circles, like the Merry Maidens in Cornwall, the Nine Maidens in Devon, Nine Ladies Stone Circle in Derbyshire. These things are all over the place, and yes, they are nearly always ladies, or women, but they're always called ladies. But these all have traditional beliefs about these monuments depicting women who have been turned into stone as punishment for dancing on the Sabbath, or basically being thought of as witches. There's folklore about the Rollright stones as well, in Oxfordshire, also used in Doctor Who, the Stones of Blood. They're actually aliens, I believe, frozen aliens. Yes, lots of nods from the Doctor Who nerds at the front there. But folklore about these stones tells that a witch turned a king, his army and his knights to stone, whilst the witch herself became an elder tree. And it's rumoured that if the tree ever gets cut, the spell will be broken and all these stones will come back to life. I don't think that's happened yet, so I assume the tree is still intact. We probably would have heard about that if that had happened. But it's really commonly recurring in folklore, these ideas of petrification, being turned to stone as a kind of punishment. So we get this idea of standing stones containing or trapping people somehow in some way. And this idea is very much woven into the plot of Children of the Stones that Bob mentioned a bit earlier. So this series from 1977 has been described as the scariest programme ever made for children. Marvellous. The story follows Professor Adam Brake, at the bottom in the middle there, and his son, and they visit the fictional village of Milbury to conduct scientific research on ancient stones. And the whole series is set and filmed, again, as Bob mentioned, within a very real stone circle at Avebury, which is home to the largest prehistoric stone circle in the world. One of the reasons this show is called Scary is because it's got an absolutely fear-inducing opening title sequence described as the most inappropriate theme music ever used for a children's TV series. So you can be the judge of that right now. Welcome to Tea Time Children's TV in the UK. Still frightens me. It's a terrifying series. So we've got these stones that we see right from the opening as looming over the camera. They're threatening presences. They're coming to get us, or they're screaming out in pain. We've got this kind of cacophony of voices chanting and wailing, very much associated with the stones, as if maybe there are people or souls trapped in the stones themselves, or somehow frozen in time. Right from the opening, we've got those ideas kind of thrown at us. Just like Nigel Neal draws upon the real history of Stonehenge, Children of the Stones weaves Avebury's real history into its narrative. In real archaeological excavations in Avebury in 1938, there was a medieval skull and partial skeleton discovered under a fallen stone. Now, the skeleton has been believed to have been what was called a travelling barber surgeon, or a type of tailor, basically, who was supposedly helping Avebury villagers dig out the underside of the stone when it fell and crushed him to death. I don't know why I said it like that, it just came across. or there are also ideas that the man was actually buried underneath the stone. Either way, there were scissors and 13th century coins found with the remains, so it allowed people to date a period when stone burial was actually taking place. So it is possible that he was buried there. In Children of the Stones, in the TV version, this story is recounted by Margaret, the adult there in the picture, who is the curator of the local museum. She says, he was helping to bury one of the stones when it crushed him to death, as you tell those stories to children. And when they re-erected the sarsen, that's just another word for like a megalith or big stone, his skeleton was found underneath. When the children asked her why were the villagers burying the stone, she says, the villagers believed that if they buried one of the stones each year, it would bring them luck. So her explanation, the explanation from the show, is linking in, we've got these sacrificial notions coming in, these luck-bringing ideas, which weren't necessarily there in real folklore. I don't know if there is such a thing as real folklore, but it's kind of very much linking recorded history with these popular notions about sacrifice traditions, but seems very plausible in the context, especially given that we've already had The Wicker Man and films like that a few years before. So it's kind of creating a new kind of folklore. That why wouldn't you believe that as a child? It all seemed, it's presented like history to me, so maybe that's real. Consider the fact that several other elements in Children of the Stones imply that events in the circle are related to extraterrestrial involvement. So if all this history is real, then maybe aliens are too, presenting this to me in quite a plausible way. We've got this notion of ancient aliens. In Children of the Stones, in brief, there's basically a beam of light that channels a beam out into space and somehow sends the villagers' personalities with it, and they're basically turned into a kind of pod people, and they're kind of being controlled by the local lord of the manor. And they're all contained within the stone circle. They can't leave this space. So we've got both in Children of the Stones and Quatermass, people being drawn to these stone circles. So also there's a suggestion that the objects, the stones themselves, are a kind of threat or trap. To connect this to more contemporary folk horror, or British folk horror, we see very similar notions about ancient stones persist. In Ben Wheatley's In the Earth, one of the modern folk horror examples I really like, we see a scientist encountering strange things happening linked to an ancient force within a large monolith. There are lots of references in the dialogue suggesting that people are drawn to it from all over, drawn to this particular stone. And even there's not a stone circle, there is just one monolith, but there's a sense of being contained there. Characters say, everything just seems to keep us here. There are also suggestions that the stone is sentient, that it can think and speak in some way. One character says, if it wants to talk, we have to listen. And one character, played by Reece Shearsmith, that you might be familiar with, he religiously worships the stone, he offers it sacrifices, and he tells quite a complex story about a practicing necromancer who was inducted into the stone, trapped here. And so along with these magical notions, there are also overt ecological themes. The stone is looked to for advice about how we can all live together without destroying each other. So certain people should be listening to these stones maybe a bit more these days. Very interestingly, I was telling Bob about this morning, that this film was made during the first heightened wave of COVID. So it was made then, and it was also came out at the cinema during COVID as well. So at the start of the film, Ben Wheatley's chosen to incorporate that into the kind of mise-en-scène. We see masks, we see personal protective equipment in the film, but COVID is never specifically mentioned. And I think it works really well. It adds this extra sense of external environmental threat. There's something going on in the world. We should be scared of the environment somehow. And adds to the idea that this stone somehow, its ancient wisdom that it can impart can help look after us or help us sort ourselves out in some way. In a similar vein, Ennis Men, from Mark Jenkins's film, set on an uninhabited island where a volunteer goes there to observe the local plant life. The landscape here is absolutely dominated by this one ancient stone that we see frequently throughout the film. There are suggestions that the stone acts as some kind of a waymarker, just kind of a landmark, or maybe even a memorial for the site of a tragic Cornish mining accident. But even those things aside, I think the stone acts very much as a character in the film. You feel like it's watching over the island in some way. And it's a really forbidding presence on screen. From some angles, it almost looks human or has a kind of a human form in some way. And for me, and this is not a spoiler, but there is a moment that I think is the most shocking moment in the film, is when you get really used to where the stone is in kind of the landscape, but there's a moment when it suddenly appears somewhere else, really briefly. But I found that really quite disturbing. Suddenly, can this stone move? What's happened? And it's quite a shocking presence, I think. So it feels very much like a warning. Ennis Men, the phrase Ennis Men is Cornish for Stone Island, and the film uses this actual stone is called Boswan's Menhir, and about which myth tells apparently animals are afraid to approach this stone. I would be interested to see what truth there is to that. I'd like to, how they know that, I don't know, just never seen any animals in its vicinity. But there is a traditional belief about stones in Cornwall, combines the idea of stones being alive and having kind of a conscious authority. And I've got a quote from a book about this from 1932, which says, "Long ago, stones were alive. They spoke and delivered judgments, distinguishing the rightful king from the usurper, the honest man from the thief." So the way the stone is used on screen in Ennis Men, it's very much kind of sitting in judgment as kind of a guardian of the past. I think that's a really interesting idea. So kind of beyond folklore and legends about stones themselves, I think an obvious aesthetic influence for the use of monoliths on screen, we can't not mention 2001: A Space Odyssey. Are the monoliths in 2001 a waymarker of human progression? Is it a space guardian? Is it a welcome sign from aliens? Is it a forbidding warning to go no further? I don't know if you remember, in late 2020, a series of monoliths appeared for real throughout the world. Initially in Utah, and kind of all across the globe, including my own hometown of Sheffield. One of my friends Ian Turley posted on Facebook. I think he was only half joking, but people couldn't resist connecting these things with alien activity. They were most likely pieces of situationist art, but the way they appeared, and again, interestingly, during the COVID era, they really captured people's imaginations. They appeared in mainstream news. There were media reports all across the globe, many of them asking artist or aliens. People couldn't resist connecting them with aliens, and were keen to speculate, is this some kind of meaning or warning? Now compare these ideas with, these are images from a 1990s US Department of Energy project. And these are proposed designs for structures to warn people away from radioactive waste storage. And to me, I don't know about you, but to me, these don't look wildly unlike standing stones, which I think is fascinating. The literal purpose of structures like these is to tell humans to keep away from this area. Do not go here. There is danger here. And there are debates about how do we communicate that to people in 10,000 years' time, when this stuff is still going to be, if we're still here, if the planet is still here, how do we keep people away from these areas? Now, if you take this into account with a couple of quotes I've got from the novelization of Quatermass, this is quite hauntingly. A character describes the ringstone round nursery rhyme I mentioned earlier, acting as this kind of message. He says, preserved as a memory transmitted through centuries of infants singing, like nuclear waste set harmlessly in blocks of glass. So the nursery rhyme is a warning to future humans. Quatermass goes on to say, men may have raised those megaliths to commemorate, to mark places that had become terrible to them, places that had been visited and left traces behind, perhaps deep under the surface. So to conclude, really, perhaps we should be keeping away from megalithic sites. In every example of folk horror, these are places where bad things happen. Dangerous things happen at stone circles. Don't visit them on your holidays. We don't know what's buried underneath, what's just under the surface. Rethink your prehistoric holiday. So whether there's a monstrous threat coming from the stones themselves, from the earth beneath, or alien peril from above, it's coming from all angles. These are very different. Folk horror notions are very different to the traditional notions as these kind of spiritual sites of worship that we kind of get from the kind of pagan ideas. Will humans in 10,000 years, if we're still here, still be going on holiday, visiting nuclear warning sites, thinking, I wonder what these people used to worship. I wonder what's buried just beneath the surface here. And there's that kind of parallel of nuclear environmental concern as well, which was very much present in 1970s and, of course, today everywhere across the globe. So maybe as Nigel Neal's Quatermass wonders, ancient stones were just a way of our ancestors trying to warn us against ourselves. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Diane. Thank you to all of our speakers, and thank you to all of you as well. Perhaps we can just sort of one more time say thank you to all of our speakers, to Bob Fisher, Derek Johnston, Diane Rodgers, and maybe a big, big round of applause for Diane's suit. Okay, we're going to take a short break now, so it's 3 o'clock now. 3:15, we're going to start with the panel discussion. So please do come back for that. It's your chance to ask any questions you want to. So have a think about any questions you might have for the panel. The format's going to be that we're going to have Bob Fisher is going to lead the discussion, and we're going to ask several questions he will ask several questions to the panel. Then we'll throw it open to you to ask some questions. So let's take a 15-minute break. Go and cheer yourself up with some beer or something, and we'll see you shortly.